I stepped closer before she could block my view again, boots crunching over fresh wood chips, and the smell of sap hit harder up close, thick and sharp like something that was not supposed to be disturbed, and that blue marker on the stump caught the light just enough for me to see the stamped seal underneath the dust, not HOA, not decorative, county issued, and that changed everything in an instant, because that marker tied those trees directly to the drainage corridor that ran beneath half this neighborhood, a system I had inspected twice last year myself, a system that controlled how storm water moved when the rains came hard and fast, and I watched one of her workers hesitate again, his saw idling low, eyes flicking between me and Rebecca like he knew something was off but did not want to be the one to say it, and Rebecca snapped again, sharper this time, telling him to keep cutting, telling him they were behind schedule, like this was just another landscaping job and not something that could ripple way past my yard, and I lifted my phone higher, making sure the marker was in frame, making sure her voice was clear, every word, every order, because she was building her own record without even realizing it, and the last oak stood there untouched for a second longer, leaves barely moving in the still air, and I remembered measuring that exact tree 2 summers ago, 38 inches in diameter, roots extending deep into the soil that fed the culvert line running under the street, and that culvert line fed into the retention basin 3 houses down, the same basin the HOA bragged about every year when hurricane season rolled around, and now they were cutting into the one thing that stabilized that entire system, and Rebecca stepped closer to me, lowering her voice like she was doing me a favor, saying this was already approved, saying I should have complied earlier, saying the neighborhood had standards, and I could hear the chipper roaring behind her. As another section of trunk disappeared into spinning blades, turning decades into seconds, and I tilted my head just enough to look past her again, locking onto that marker, and then to the next stump, and the next, because once you know what to look for, you cannot unsee it, and suddenly it was not just one tree, it was a line, a pattern, every single one of them sitting right along the mapped corridor I had filed reports on, and that meant permits, inspections, approvals, layers she clearly never checked, and I felt my grip tighten on the phone, not from anger, but from clarity. Because this was no longer a misunderstanding or a petty HOA move, this was a breach tied into county infrastructure, and those do not stay quiet for long, and I took one step back, giving her space, letting her think she had control again, because sometimes the fastest way to stop someone is to let them keep going just a little longer, and the worker finally raised his saw toward the last oak, hesitating just a fraction too long, and I knew exactly what he was seeing now, even if he could not name it yet. And Rebecca waved him forward anyway, pushing past that hesitation like it did not matter, like none of this mattered beyond her checklist, and that was the moment I realized she was not going to stop on her own. I did not tell her to stop. I just lowered my phone and stepped back onto the gravel, letting the sound of the saw fill the space between us as the worker finally pressed the blade into the last oak, and the first bite into that trunk sounded different, heavier, like the tree itself was pushing back through the steel, and the vibration traveled up through the ground into my boots, subtle but there, and that told me everything about how deep those roots ran under the soil, feeding straight into the drainage line beneath the street, the same line I had mapped down to the inch during the last inspection cycle, and Rebecca stood there watching it happen like she had already won, one hand on her hip, the other still clutching that clipboard like it gave her authority over things she did not even understand, and I shifted my angle just enough to capture the base of the tree, zooming in on the metal tag partially embedded near the root flare, and the camera picked it up clean this time, blue enamel chipped but still readable, county registry code stamped into the surface, and that code tied directly to a file sitting in my office, a file that controlled how this entire section of land handled water flow during storm surges, and I felt my breathing slow down, steady, measured, because this was no longer about reacting, it was about documenting. And I moved along the edge of the yard, capturing each stump, each tag, each cut that lined up perfectly along that invisible corridor beneath the grass. And the pattern was too precise to be accidental, which meant she had ordered this without ever checking what sat under her own neighborhood, and one of the workers killed his saw again, longer this time, wiping his face with the back of his glove, eyes lingering on the tag like he was starting to connect the dots, and Rebecca snapped at him to keep going, voice tighter now, less confident than before, and that shift was small but real, and I filed it away, because cracks like that only grow when pressure builds, And I could already feel the weight of what she had triggered pressing outward beyond my property line, past the curb, past the sidewalks, into every yard that relied on that drainage system to keep their foundations dry, and a light breeze carried the smell of cut wood across the street where a neighbor had stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed, watching quietly, and more doors opened down the block, people drawn by the noise, by the sight of trees falling where they had stood for decades. And I kept recording, panning slowly, making sure every face, every reaction, every second of this was preserved exactly as it happened, because once this moved beyond here, details would matter, and the final cut went through with a long crack that echoed down the street, the tree leaning, then dropping across the yard with a heavy thud that shook loose dirt from the roots, exposing more of that underground structure than anyone here was supposed to see, and for a brief second, everything went quiet except for the chipper winding down. And I stared at the exposed roots, tracing the direction they ran under the surface, straight toward the culvert line, and I knew exactly what that meant for the next heavy rain, and I slipped my phone into my pocket, already thinking 3 steps ahead, because the damage was no longer theoretical, it was set in motion, and she had just removed the one thing holding it in place, and Rebecca was still standing there waiting for me to argue, waiting for me to react, but I just looked at her, then at the street, then back at the stumps, and turned toward my truck instead, because there was only one place I needed to go next. I opened my truck door and the heat trapped inside hit my face, thick with the smell of leather and dust, but my hands moved fast, steady, pulling my laptop bag from the passenger seat while the sound of the chipper kicked back to life behind me, louder now, like it was trying to erase what just happened, and I could feel eyes on my back as I set the bag on the hood and flipped it open, the metal warm under my palms. And Rebecca's voice carried across the yard again, sharper this time, asking where I thought I was going, telling me this was not finished, but she did not understand that for me, it had just started, and the screen lit up, bright against the daylight, and I pulled up the county portal without hesitation, fingers moving through menus I knew by muscle memory, and within seconds the corridor map loaded, clean lines cutting through the neighborhood grid, and there it was, exactly where I knew it would be. A protected drainage route running straight through my front yard. Marked in blue, tied to every tag I had just recorded, and I zoomed in, overlaying the inspection data from last season, and each tree she had removed lit up like a missing anchor point, and the system did not need imagination to show what that meant, it calculated it, projected it, water flow paths shifting, soil stability weakening, pressure redistributing toward the lowest points in the block. And those lowest points were not on my property, and I let that sit for a second, watching the model adjust itself in real time, because this was the part most people never saw, the part that turned a simple cut into a chain reaction, and a shadow fell across the hood, and I looked up to see one of the workers standing a few feet away, helmet tilted back, eyes flicking between the screen and the yard behind me, and he did not say anything at first, just nodded once toward the map like he recognized enough to know it was not good, and then he stepped back without a word, like he wanted no part in what came next, and that silence spoke louder than anything Rebecca had said all morning, and I reached into my bag again and pulled out the small field notebook I carried on every site visit, flipping to the last inspection entry for this address, and the notes were still there, clear, dated, signed, each tree listed with measurements, condition ratings, and the registry codes that matched the tags now buried under fresh cuts, and I held the page up next to the screen, lining them up, one to one, because documentation only matters when it connects, and this connected perfectly, and behind me, Rebecca's footsteps came closer, slower now, less certain, and she leaned just enough to see the screen, her reflection faint in the glass, and for the first time. She did not speak right away, and I could hear the chipper stop again, the sudden quiet stretching across the yard as more workers noticed the shift, and neighbors were still watching from their porches, their attention no longer on the noise, but on whatever had just changed in the air, and Rebecca finally broke the silence, asking what I was doing in a tone that tried to sound controlled but landed somewhere else, and I closed the notebook, not answering, just letting the screen stay visible. A second longer before I reached for my phone again, because the next step was not about convincing her, it was about bringing in the people who actually had authority over that map, over those tags, over everything she had just cut through without even realizing it, and I scrolled to the contact I needed, thumb hovering for half a second as I glanced once more at the yard, at the stumps, at the line they formed, and then back at the screen, because once this call went through, there was no walking it back, and I pressed dial. I held the phone to my ear and turned slightly away from Rebecca, giving the call space as it rang once, then twice, the sound of it cutting through the quiet that had settled over the yard, and when the line clicked, I spoke clearly, stating my name, my certification number, and the address without hesitation, because details matter in the first 10 seconds, and I could hear the shift on the other end as soon as I mentioned the corridor code, a pause that meant someone was already pulling up the same map I had open on my hood, and I described what had just been removed, one tree at a time, matching registry tags to their positions along the drainage line. And behind me I could feel Rebecca watching, waiting for me to slip, waiting for this to be something she could still manage, but the longer I spoke, the quieter she got, and the chipper never started again, and the men who had been working just stood there, hands on hips, helmets tilted back, listening without pretending not to, and I stepped to the side, angling the phone toward the yard just enough so the line could pick up the ambient sound, the open space where those trees used to stand. Because sometimes silence tells more than noise, and the voice on the other end asked me one question, short, direct, whether any stabilization measures had been approved or installed prior to removal, and I answered just as direct, no, and that single word seemed to carry more weight than everything else I had said, and I watched Rebecca shift her stance, adjusting the clipboard against her chest like it could shield her from what she was starting to understand, and I walked a few steps toward the nearest stump, crouching just enough to brush away more of the sawdust with my boot, exposing the metal tag fully this time, and I read the code aloud, slow, deliberate, letting each number land clearly through the call, and when I finished, there was no immediate response, just a longer silence than before, the kind that meant something had escalated beyond routine, and I stood up again, turning back toward the street, where more neighbors had gathered, their voices low, uncertain, like they could feel the shift but did not know the details yet, and I ended the call without ceremony, no goodbye, just a clean disconnect, because the next steps were already in motion on the other side, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket, eyes moving across the yard, measuring what was gone against what I knew should still be there, and the gap felt larger now, not just physically, but structurally, like something had been pulled loose beneath the surface, and Rebecca finally stepped closer again, her voice lower, asking who I had called, and I met her eyes for the first time since this started, not raising my voice, not explaining, just holding the moment long enough for her to see that this was no longer something she could direct or contain, and she tried to recover, saying they had permits, saying everything was approved, but the words did not carry the same certainty they had earlier, and I reached back to the hood of my truck, turning the laptop so the map faced her fully, the blue corridor line cutting straight through the empty space where the trees had stood, and I tapped one point along it, then another, matching them to the stumps behind her without saying a word. And the connection was obvious now, even to someone who had never looked at this kind of data before, and I could see it register in her posture, in the way her shoulders tightened just slightly, and for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, and the entire yard held still around that realization, and then, from somewhere down the street, the low rumble of an approaching engine broke the silence, growing louder with each second, and I did not need to turn around to know it was heading straight for this address. The engine noise grew louder, steady and heavy, until a white county truck rolled into view and slowed right in front of my driveway, tires crunching over loose gravel and wood chips like it was entering a scene it already understood, and the logo on the door caught the light just enough for everyone to read it, environmental and infrastructure compliance, and that changed the air instantly, because this was no longer neighborhood business, and the driver stepped out before the truck fully settled, clipboard already in hand, scanning the yard without asking a single question, and I watched his eyes move from stump to stump, pausing just long enough at each cut to register what had been removed, and he did not look surprised, which told me the call had landed exactly where it needed to, and behind me I could hear Rebecca shift again, her shoes scraping lightly against the ground as she adjusted her stance, preparing to speak, but the man did not give her the opening. He walked straight past her and stopped near the first exposed tag, crouching slightly to get a closer look, brushing away the remaining dust with the edge of his pen, and the moment that blue marker cleared fully into view, his expression tightened just a fraction, not dramatic, just enough to signal that something here had crossed a line, and he stood up slowly, turning his head toward the rest of the yard, tracing the invisible line those trees had once formed, and I could see him mapping it in real time, the same way I had minutes earlier, connecting each removal to the corridor beneath, and he finally spoke, voice calm, controlled, asking one simple question about who authorized the removal, and Rebecca stepped forward immediately, voice quick, confident again but thinner now, explaining HOA procedures, approvals, compliance actions, and I watched the man listen without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the stumps, and when she finished, he asked for documentation, just that, nothing more, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the chainsaws had. Because this was where paperwork either held or collapsed, and Rebecca flipped through her clipboard, papers shifting, edges catching the light, but her movement slowed as she searched, like she was realizing the answer was not where she expected it to be, and the man did not rush her, did not repeat himself, just stood there waiting, and I stepped slightly to the side, giving them both space, because this part was not about me anymore, it was about what had already been done, and the neighbors across the street had gone quiet, their attention fixed entirely on the exchange, and even the workers had stepped back from their equipment, standing in a loose line near the truck, watching like they were seeing the job from a different angle now, and Rebecca finally handed over a sheet, 1 page, standard HOA notice format, and the man took it without comment, eyes scanning it quickly, then lowering it again as he looked back at the yard, and he asked another question, slower this time, about county permits tied to protected infrastructure, and that was the moment the shift became visible to everyone, because Rebecca did not answer right away, and in that pause, you could almost hear the connection snap into place, the realization moving from the ground up, from those stumps, through the corridor beneath, into every line of authority that had just been triggered, and the man turned slightly, looking down the street toward the retention basin at the far end of the block, then back at the exposed roots, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before reaching for his radio, and I knew the next step was already moving beyond this yard. The radio crackled in his hand and the sound carried across the yard, sharp and official, and every head turned toward it like the entire block understood something had just escalated again, and he spoke into it calmly, reading off the corridor code I had given, confirming unauthorized removal tied to protected infrastructure, and I watched Rebecca's posture shift again, smaller this time, the confidence draining out of her shoulders as each word landed, and the workers stepped even farther back, one of them pulling off his gloves and tucking them into his belt like the job was already over in his mind, and the man from the county lowered the radio and walked slowly along the line where the trees had stood, counting under his breath, eyes scanning the ground, and he stopped at the largest stump, placing the tip of his boot against the exposed roots, pressing lightly as if testing the soil, and it gave just enough to show what had been holding it together before, and he nodded once. Then turned back toward Rebecca, asking her again for any permit that referenced this corridor specifically, and this time she did not answer right away, her fingers flipping through the same pages with less purpose, the sound of paper louder in the silence, and when she finally spoke, it was slower, less certain, repeating the same HOA approval language that no longer fit what was happening here, and the man listened for a second, then cut in, not raising his voice, just tightening it slightly, explaining that HOA authority does not extend into protected county systems, and that phrase landed harder than anything else, because it drew a clear line between what she thought she controlled and what she actually touched, and I could see the realization move through the small crowd now. Neighbors exchanging looks, glancing from the stumps to the county truck and back again, and someone across the street pulled out their phone, starting to record, and that small shift multiplied quickly, more screens coming up, more eyes focusing, and Rebecca noticed it too, her head turning slightly, tracking the attention, and for the first time she looked outnumbered, not by people, but by the situation itself, and the county inspector reached into his truck and pulled out a bright orange notice, the color almost too vivid against the muted tones of the yard, and he walked back toward the center of the property, placing it flat against the hood of my truck for a moment as he filled in the details, pen moving quickly, precise, and I did not need to read it to know what it said, because I had seen that form before on other sites, other projects that had gone wrong, and it never ended small, and he peeled it off the pad and turned toward Rebecca, holding it out without ceremony, and she hesitated before taking it, just a fraction too long, like her hand needed time to catch up with what her mind was still processing, and when she finally grabbed it, the paper shook slightly, and she scanned it quickly, eyes moving faster than her breathing, and then she looked up, starting to speak again, something about resolving this, about fixing it, about making it right, but the inspector shook his head once, cutting through the attempt, explaining that the issue was already beyond immediate correction, that further review and assessment would be required, and that statement carried weight, final and immovable, and I watched Rebecca stand there holding that orange notice, the clipboard forgotten at her side, and the entire yard seemed to shift around her, no longer a project, no longer a decision she controlled, but a site under review, and I glanced back toward the exposed roots, tracing their direction again toward the street, toward the basin beyond, and the air felt different now, heavier, like it was waiting for something else to follow, and in the distance, thunder rolled low across the sky. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, low and heavy, and the air shifted just enough for me to feel the pressure drop, that subtle change you only notice when you have spent years watching how land reacts before a storm, and I looked down the line of exposed roots again, tracing where they used to hold the soil tight along the corridor, and now there was nothing but loose earth and broken structure, and the inspector stepped back toward his truck, speaking into the radio again, voice steady, calling for a secondary assessment team, and that told me this was moving beyond a single visit, beyond a simple notice, and Rebecca stood frozen for a second longer, the orange paper still in her hand, before she tried to regain control, stepping forward and asking what exactly needed to be done to fix this, her voice catching slightly on the word fix, and the inspector turned back to her, slower this time, explaining that restoration of a protected corridor was not immediate, not simple, and not optional, and each word seemed to land heavier than the last, and I watched her process that, her eyes flicking toward the street, toward the neighbors, toward the line where the trees had stood, like she was seeing it differently now, not as overgrowth, but as something structural, something she had removed without understanding, and a gust of wind moved through the yard, lifting loose sawdust into the air, carrying it across the driveway in a thin cloud that stung slightly when it hit my face, and for a moment the entire space felt exposed, open in a way it had never been before, and the first drops of rain hit the hood of my truck, soft at first, spaced out, tapping lightly against the metal, and I could hear the change immediately, the sound of water hitting ground that was no longer anchored the way it should be, soaking in too fast in some spots, pooling in others, and the inspector noticed it too, his head tilting slightly as he watched the surface react, and he stepped toward the nearest stump again, crouching just enough to see how the soil shifted under the new moisture, and he did not say anything, but the look he gave the ground said enough, and behind him one of the workers moved instinctively toward the equipment, like he was thinking about packing up, but hesitated when he saw the inspector still evaluating the site, and Rebecca took another step forward, asking if the HOA insurance would cover this, and that question hung in the air longer than expected, because it revealed exactly where her thinking still was, and the inspector stood up slowly, brushing his hands together once, and answered carefully, saying coverage would depend on findings, permits, and whether the removal violated protected status knowingly or not, and that distinction seemed to settle heavily on her, because it was no longer about fixing a mistake, it was about proving how it happened, and I stepped back toward the edge of the driveway, giving the rain more space to show what it was starting to do, small rivulets forming along the disturbed soil, finding paths where roots used to block them, and I followed one with my eyes as it moved toward the curb, then toward the storm inlet down the street, and I knew that once the rain picked up, those paths would widen, accelerate, and carry more than just water, and the inspector turned his head in the same direction, tracking that movement, and I could see him calculating it the same way I was, connecting the removal to the flow, to the system beyond what anyone here could see directly, and the rain began to fall harder, faster now, filling the quiet with a steady rhythm, and I glanced once more at Rebecca, still standing there with the orange notice in her hand, and then back at the ground as the first real runoff began to form. The rain came down harder, steady now, soaking into the exposed ground where roots used to hold everything in place, and I watched the water gather faster than it should, forming thin streams that cut through the loose soil and carried bits of sawdust toward the curb, and it did not take long for those streams to connect, merging into a wider flow that moved with purpose, following the exact path the corridor map had predicted, and the inspector stepped closer to the edge of the driveway, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground as he tracked the movement, eyes locked on how quickly the runoff was building, and he did not need to say anything, Because the system was already responding, already showing the consequence of what had been removed, and Rebecca stood a few feet behind him, still holding that orange notice, now damp at the edges, her grip tighter than before, and she looked down at the water like she was seeing it for the first time, not as rain, but as something that had direction now, something that was moving where it was not supposed to move, and across the street, one of the neighbors stepped off the curb, pointing toward the storm inlet further down, where the water was already arriving faster than normal, and the sound changed there, from scattered drops to a steady rush, echoing faintly as it hit metal and concrete, and I followed it with my eyes, tracing the flow from my yard to the street, to the inlet, and beyond that, toward the retention basin that handled overflow for the entire block, and the inspector lifted his radio again, voice firmer this time, calling in the early runoff response, referencing potential instability along the corridor, and that phrase carried weight, because it meant this was no longer about damage, it was about containment, and one of the workers moved quickly to shut down the remaining equipment completely, like the job had officially crossed into something else, and Rebecca finally stepped forward again, asking if this was going to flood, her voice lower now, stripped of the control she had earlier, and the inspector did not answer directly, just watched the water for another second, then looked back at the exposed roots. And the line of stumps, and that silence told her enough, and I shifted slightly, giving them space, letting the scene unfold without interruption, because everything that needed to be seen was already visible, and the rain kept building, each drop adding to the flow, each second widening the channels cut through the soil, and I could see the pattern locking in, the new paths forming where the old ones had been stabilized before, and those paths did not stop at my property line, they carried forward, feeding into a system that no longer had its anchors, and the inspector stepped back toward his truck, already preparing for the next phase. And I glanced once more at the yard, at what was gone, then at what was moving through it now, and I knew this was only the beginning of what she had set in motion, and as the water surged past the curb and into the street, the first real wave of runoff hit the inlet all at once.